there is a question almost nobody dares to ask about the Garden of Eden. Not because the question is impossible, but because once it enters your mind, the entire story begins to change. What if humanity was never punished for becoming evil? What if humanity was punished for becoming aware? Because when you look carefully at the story you were given as a child, something strange begins to emerge from beneath the surface. The serpent tells Eve, "Your eyes will be opened," and then they are. Adam and Eve do not become monsters, they do not become violent, they do not suddenly transform into demons. They become conscious, they recognize themselves, they become aware of their condition. They see the world differently than they did before, and then they are removed. For centuries, this story has been framed as humanity's greatest mistake. The moment innocence was destroyed, the beginning of sin, suffering, and separation from God. But hidden beneath the official interpretation was another reading entirely, a forbidden reading, a reading so dangerous that many of the texts containing it were buried beneath the sands of Egypt for over 1600 years. Because according to the ancient Gnostics, Eden was never a paradise. It was a cage, and the serpent was never the villain. It was the first voice that told humanity to wake up. Tonight, we are going deeper than the version taught in churches and classrooms. We are entering the hidden interpretation of Genesis preserved inside the ancient Gnostic texts, writings that describe the God of Eden not as the highest divine source, but as something else entirely. A lesser creator, a ruler of limitation, a being terrified that humanity might discover what it truly is. Because according to these texts, there is something hidden inside the human being that this world was never designed to awaken. The Gnostics called it the divine spark, and once it begins to stir, nothing can return to the way it was before. This is not just a story about the past. This is a story about consciousness itself, about perception, about the moment a human being begins to see through the structure surrounding them. And maybe that is why the story has survived for thousands of years, because somewhere beneath the symbolism, it is describing something happening inside people even now. Long before Christianity became an organized institution, before doctrine was finalized, before bishops decided which texts would survive and which would disappear, there were radically different interpretations of reality circulating among early spiritual groups. Some of these groups would later be called Gnostics. The word Gnostic comes from the Greek word Gnosis, meaning direct knowledge, not belief, not faith, but inner recognition. And this distinction changes everything. Because the Gnostics were not primarily interested in obedience, they were interested in awakening. To them, the human problem was not simply moral failure. It was unconsciousness. Human beings were asleep inside a reality they mistook for the whole. And hidden within ancient texts discovered near Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945 was a version of Genesis so different that it almost feels like reading an entirely different religion. Texts like the Apocryphon of John, the Hypostasis of the Archons, and the Gospel of Truth describe a universe layered with hidden realities beyond the visible world. At the center of this interpretation is a shocking claim. The creator of the material world is not the highest god. Instead, the physical universe was shaped by a lesser being called the Demiurge. The Gnostics gave this figure many names, but one appears repeatedly: Yaldabaoth, a creator born from ignorance, a being powerful enough to shape matter, but blind to the fullness beyond himself. According to the myth, Yaldabaoth believes he is the only god because he cannot perceive the higher divine reality above him. And this is where the Genesis story changes completely. Because if the creator is incomplete, then the world he creates may also be incomplete. Suddenly, Eden is no longer a perfect paradise. It becomes something much stranger, a controlled environment, a reality designed to keep humanity unaware of what lies beyond it. And once you see the story through this lens, every symbol begins to transform. The tree, the command, the serpent, the exile, none of them mean what you were taught they meant. There is a line in Genesis that becomes deeply unsettling once you examine it closely. After Adam and Eve eat from the tree, God says, "The man has now become like one of us, knowing good and evil." Then comes something even stranger. The human beings are expelled before they can eat from the tree of life and become immortal. Why fear what they might become? Why guard knowledge so aggressively? Why place the tree in the garden at all, if awareness itself was forbidden? These questions haunted the Gnostics, because to them the behavior of the God in Eden did not resemble infinite wisdom, it resembled control. In the Gnostic interpretation, the Demiurge creates humanity but unknowingly traps within it something far beyond his own understanding, the divine spark, a fragment of the higher reality, a hidden essence connected not to the creator of the material world, but to the transcendent source beyond him. This changes the entire psychological structure of the Eden story, because the command suddenly sounds less like protection and more like containment. Do not eat, do not question, do not perceive beyond the boundaries of the system. Remain unconscious, remain obedient, remain asleep. And perhaps the most disturbing possibility of all is this. What if the greatest fear of the Demiurge was not human sin, but human awakening? Because once a being becomes aware of its condition, it can no longer be controlled in the same way. Once perception changes, the structure holding perception together begins to weaken. And that is exactly what happens in Eden. The serpent may be the most misunderstood symbol in religious history. For thousands of years it has been associated with deception, evil, temptation, corruption. But across ancient cultures, the serpent carried a very different meaning: transformation, hidden wisdom, rebirth, awakening. The serpent sheds its skin. It dies into a new form. It becomes a symbol of consciousness evolving beyond previous limitations. And inside the Gnostic texts, the serpent is not presented as a destroyer of humanity. It becomes the catalyst of awareness. Notice something crucial. The serpent never forces Adam and Eve to eat. It introduces a possibility, a question, a crack in certainty. Your eyes will be opened. And that is exactly what happens. The serpent does not create awareness, it activates it, like a spark touching something already waiting beneath the surface. And perhaps that is why the symbolism remains so psychologically powerful even today, because nearly every human being eventually encounters a moment like this. A realization, a contradiction, a sudden perception that something about reality no longer fits the narrative they inherited. At first it feels small, almost insignificant, but once seen, it cannot be unseen. That is the true power of awareness. Not that it destroys the world, but that it changes your relationship to it forever. There is a subtle detail in Genesis most people never stop to consider. After eating the fruit, Adam and Eve become aware of their nakedness. Think carefully about that. Their bodies did not change, reality did not change, the garden did not disappear, perception changed. This is the core of the Gnostic interpretation. The fruit symbolizes the transition from unconscious existence to reflective awareness. Before the fruit, Adam and Eve existed inside reality. After the fruit, they became capable of observing reality. That difference is enormous, because the moment a being can observe its condition, it becomes psychologically separate from total immersion within it. Self-awareness is born, and self-awareness always introduces tension. The Gnostics saw this as the birth of human consciousness itself, not biological awakening, existential awakening. The moment humanity recognized itself as distinct from the environment surrounding it, and once that recognition occurs, innocence becomes impossible to return to. Not because awareness is evil, but because awareness permanently alters experience. You cannot unknow something. You cannot return to a dream once you realize you are dreaming. This is why the fall begins to look less like moral collapse and more like irreversible awakening. What if Eden was never a physical location? What if it was a state of consciousness? The Gnostics interpreted the garden symbolically. A condition of total immersion, a reality where questioning had not yet begun, where awareness remained dormant. And once consciousness awakens inside such a state, exile becomes inevitable. Not because someone throws you out, but because you no longer fit inside the structure the same way. This happens constantly in ordinary human life. A person wakes up to manipulation inside a relationship. They cannot unknow it. Someone sees corruption within an institution they trusted. They cannot return to naive belief. A person begins questioning inherited assumptions about reality, identity, culture, or religion. Something changes permanently. The old psychological environment becomes incompatible with new awareness. This is Eden, not ancient history, a recurring human experience. The movement from unconscious participation to conscious observation. And perhaps this is why awakening so often feels painful at first, because certainty dies before understanding is fully born. In many Gnostic texts, the Demiurge is not alone. He is accompanied by entities called archons, the rulers. For the Gnostics, the archons represented forces that maintain humanity's unconscious condition. Not necessarily demons in the simplistic sense, but structures of limitation. forces that keep consciousness identified exclusively with material existence: fear, distraction, blind obedience, false identity, psychological conditioning, the constant reinforcement of external definitions. The archons maintain the illusion by keeping attention trapped outward, never inward, never upward, never beyond. And whether taken literally, symbolically, or psychologically, the idea remains disturbingly relevant, because modern systems also compete constantly for human attention. Noise everywhere, stimulation everywhere, endless distraction, a culture that rarely encourages deep self-examination, a civilization obsessed with consumption but uncomfortable with silence. The Gnostics believed awakening required piercing through these layers of illusion, not through blind belief, but through direct inner recognition. Gnosis. At the center of Gnostic thought lies one of the most radical spiritual ideas ever conceived, that something divine already exists within the human being. Not metaphorically, not symbolically alone, but fundamentally, the divine spark is not earned, it is remembered. Hidden beneath conditioning, fear, identity, and illusion is a deeper consciousness connected to the higher source beyond the material world. This is why the Gnostics emphasized inner awakening over external authority, because if the divine already exists within, then ultimate truth cannot be monopolized by institutions. It must eventually be encountered directly, and this idea terrified religious authorities throughout history, because systems built on mediation lose power when people begin seeking direct experience instead of external permission. The Gnostics were condemned as heretics partly because they shifted spiritual authority inward. Not toward ego, but toward awareness, toward inner recognition, toward Gnosis. The serpent appears everywhere: Egypt, India, Greece, Mesoamerica, Mesopotamia. Again and again, the symbol emerges connected not merely to danger, but to hidden knowledge and transformation. In yogic traditions, Kundalini is depicted as a coiled serpent resting at the base of the spine, dormant energy waiting to awaken. When it rises, perception changes, identity shifts, reality feels different. Not because the external world transformed, but because consciousness itself changed frequency. The parallels with Eden are difficult to ignore. A serpent, an awakening, a transition into expanded awareness, the collapse of previous perception. Perhaps ancient civilizations were pointing toward the same psychological mystery through different symbolic languages. That human consciousness contains latent depths most people never fully access, and that awakening those depths permanently changes perception. One of the greatest misconceptions about awakening is that it feels immediately liberating. Often it does not. Often it feels destabilizing, because awareness dismantles illusions before it reveals clarity. The old certainty dies first. This is why many people instinctively retreat from difficult questions. Because certainty feels safer than ambiguity. The familiar feels safer than the unknown. But the Gnostics understood something profound. Discomfort is often the beginning of transformation. The crack appearing in the inherited worldview is not necessarily destruction. It may be expansion. And perhaps this is why the Eden story continues to resonate emotionally after thousands of years. Because every conscious person eventually faces moments where reality becomes less solid than it once appeared. Moments where inherited narratives begin to fracture. Moments where the mind quietly whispers, "What if there is more than this?" The Gnostics distinguished belief from knowing. Belief can be inherited. Knowing must be experienced. Gnosis was not intellectual information. It was recognition, a direct encounter with deeper reality. And according to the Gnostics, this recognition changes a person from within. Not through force, not through dogma, but through perception. The awakening of the divine spark is subtle at first, a growing awareness of the difference between what you truly know and what you were conditioned to accept. The difference between authentic perception and inherited programming, the difference between reality and the stories layered over reality. This is why the Gnostics viewed awakening not as rebellion against God, but as remembrance of the true source beyond illusion. If this interpretation of Eden is reshaping the way you see the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Because these ancient texts were buried for centuries for a reason. And on this channel, we explore the hidden ideas, forgotten scriptures, and suppressed interpretations that challenge the surface version of reality most people were taught to accept. Also comment below, was the serpent a deceiver or the first awakener? Every system fears one thing more than rebellion: awareness. Because rebellion can often be controlled, awareness cannot. A person who sees clearly becomes difficult to manipulate. And maybe that is why so many ancient stories revolve around forbidden knowledge. Not because knowledge itself is evil, but because awareness transforms the one who receives it. The Eden story may ultimately be asking the most dangerous question imaginable. What happens when consciousness realizes it is more than the system surrounding it? Because once that realization begins, the process cannot fully reverse. Perhaps Eden was never destroyed. Perhaps it still exists psychologically. Everywhere people remain asleep inside inherited structures without questioning them. Everywhere awareness is feared. Everywhere certainty is worshipped more than truth. And perhaps the serpent still appears too. Not necessarily as an external figure, but as moments of interruption, questions, contradictions, insights, experiences that crack the surface of ordinary perception. The quiet realization that reality may be larger than the version presented to you. And maybe that is why the story still feels alive. Because it is not only describing ancient humanity, it is describing an ongoing human condition. Perhaps Eden still exists psychologically. Everywhere people remain asleep inside inherited beliefs without questioning them. Everywhere distraction replaces reflection. Everywhere certainty becomes more important than truth. And perhaps the serpent still appears too, not as a literal being, but as interruptions, questions, contradictions, moments where something suddenly feels incomplete. The quiet realization that reality may be larger than the version you inherited. The Gnostics distinguished belief from knowing. Belief can be inherited. Gnosis must be experienced. This is why Gnostic awakening is subtle. It begins as recognition, a growing awareness of the difference between what you truly know and what you are conditioned to accept. The difference between direct experience and inherited narratives. The divine spark awakening inside the human being is not dramatic at first. It begins quietly, like a crack forming beneath the surface of ordinary perception. So what if Eden was never really about humanity becoming sinful? What if it was about humanity becoming conscious? What if the fruit symbolized awakening? What if the serpent symbolized transformation? What if exile symbolized the irreversible loss of unconsciousness? And what if the fall was actually the beginning? The beginning of self-awareness, the beginning of questioning, the beginning of seeing beyond the illusion. Maybe this is why the story still resonates thousands of years later. Because beneath the symbolism, it describes something deeply human. The terrifying, painful, transformative moment. Consciousness wakes up and realizes the reality surrounding it may not be the whole picture. And once that process begins, there is no going back to sleep completely, only forward, toward deeper awareness, toward Gnosis, toward the possibility that the voice saying, "Do not know," was never the voice of ultimate truth at all. If this video resonated with you, subscribe and turn on notifications because the next video goes even deeper into the hidden Gnostic worldview, the Demiurge, the false god behind the material world. Escaping the Illusion, a Gnostic guide to mastering reality link in the description. Because once you begin seeing the symbols differently, you start realizing the ancient world may have been hiding something about consciousness that modern humanity forgot.